Hey guys, it's me, Wolf, back with another Stronghold Crusader build. In the last episode we've built a woodcutter that can now supply us with the most basic building material, wood. But felling trees and cutting up wooden planks is tough and labor intensive, and we need to keep our workers well fed during the process. Normally I'm starting with a couple of apple farms in the game, but I thought that a nice wheel of cheese is even more nourishing. And also, I don't really know how to make the little trees, So that's why I'm attempting to build a dairy farm today. I'm starting out with a simple piece of wood that I've cut into a 10x10mm square stick. When starting out I was using the fence that came with the bandsaw, but I've later replaced it with a simple square aluminium pipe and some clamps to lower the saw guide down. Like this the blade has less play and I'm getting preciser cuts. At least I thought I would. Wood because I cut wood. No, in this sped up footage here you can see how the bandsaw blade drifts outwards, and I still have to learn a lot on how to use this machine and how to calibrate it correctly, cause I've bought it quite recently. But anyways, I wanted the 4 corner posts to be 8 cm tall, and like last time I also want them to be partially buried in some soil again. After using one of them as a template, I've ended up with 6 little sticks where I've used my caliper to make a groove in the middle of 2 of them. And I've traced it here again with a pencil so you can see it better. I've cut out this little square with a Japanese saw, a tool that I also still need a lot of practice in, but the result was presentable enough for me, but a little sanding still won't hurt. I've made this groove in the beam because in-game the roof is filled in with wooden planks in the front and probably the back too. And my idea was to have these cuts on the bottom and the 2 roof beams to attach the wooden planks there. But more on that later. One little detail from the game are these 45-degree beams for support, so I went ahead and also made some. To connect them to the posts I'm using the tiniest nails I own, and to prevent the wood from splitting I've pre-drilled the holes with my Dremel tool and hammered them in place. Once I've made all 4 of them I've laid them on a piece of paper and used some wood glue to connect the pieces. Actually, it took too long and I've used super glue again. For the roof I've cut 4 more sticks with an angle of 45 degrees on both sides, the groove for the wooden planks and a little cut where it rests on the base. This was the most intricate little part I've made so far. I've laid them on a piece of paper again to glue them together, and while this was drying I've also connected the other 2 parts with 2 simple beams. And to finish off the basic structure I've glued the roof beams onto the base. For the front wall I've cut out a piece of paper to have a 1:1 template, and I've used some thin strips of wood in different sizes to make it look more scuffed. With all the pieces ready, the only thing left to do was glue them all into place. I've obviously did the same thing for the back too. I wanted to put 3 more support beams across the roof so that the cloth doesn't fall into the building, but before finishing the second side I thought, there's this big open space beneath the roof, and this was probably used as some kind of storage. So I went ahead and glued more of these different sized wooden planks onto a stick and left a hole in one corner to actually have access to the storage room. After gluing the floor for the storage and the 3 wooden cross beams on the roof in place, we end up with a nice little building. I said before that I want the corner posts from the building to be partially buried in some soil like last time, so it's time for the wooden box again. I've already explained it in the woodcutter video how I've made this. I mean, not like there's a lot of explaining to do, but I've once again cut 4 thinner slices of wood for the walls and made them look older by burning them and later scrubbing them with a steel brush. Then I've nailed the sides to a thicker square piece of wood and we end up with a nice wooden box. Here's the comparison to the woodcutter. And here's a little info on how I'm measuring the buildings in-game. I started with the woodcutter and just decided that it is 10x10 cm big, and from now on I'm going to use the woodcutter as a reference in deciding how big the building, or at least the foundation, is going to be. Now this isn't precise, it also doesn't need to be in my opinion, so I'm not going to count pixels and make my own ratio. So little children, if a woodcutter is 10 cm long and we can put 3 woodcutters next to each other to get the size of a dairy farm, how long is the dairy farm?
21.
Around the whole pasture we obviously still need a fence, and I don't really know why in the game there are these big gaps there. I mean, at least I can't think of a good reason, but nonetheless I'm starting with cutting out some 5x5mm sticks again. And to make all the fence pieces exactly the same way, I've drawn a template on a piece of paper where I can simply lay out the sticks and glue them together. To make a connection between these 4 pole fences, I've only used 2 poles and a crossbar of the same length. In total I've made 8 pieces for the corners and 3 connection pieces. To make them look a little nicer, I've still drilled some holes through the stick that goes across and hammered in some nails. Now there's only one thing missing for the fence, and that is the gate. I didn't film a whole lot of the making process, but I've simply glued 4 sticks together and also added 1 diagonally. Then I've made some mini tiny hinges that were definitely not worth making myself, but I still wanted to try it, and they are doing their job. On the one side where the gate isn't connected to the pole, I've also added a little closing mechanism. Now the farmer has a place to keep his cattle and has a nice and cozy building, but he still needs a place to sit and something to store the milk in. We're starting with the little milking stool. I've used a roll of electrical tape to make a circle on a thin piece of wood and cut it out with my bandsaw. After some sanding, I took it over to the vise and drew 3 dots where I wanted to drill the holes for the legs. Now careful, I don't want to go all the way through. This never happened, and after drilling the 3 holes perfectly and shaping a little round stick, I've used some super glue again to glue the 3 legs into the stool. Now it ain't much, but it's honest work. For the bucket I've started with cutting some thin strips of wood, and to split them in half I've simply rocked a little back and forth with a cutter knife. Then I've used some sandpaper to taper the little pieces on one side, and I've also used my box cutter again to angle the sides of the pieces. Now it tapers towards the bottom and has the shape of a trapezoid. Bless you! I've also made a simple little ring out of some sheet metal by gluing the ends together, and I've started to glue the individual pieces in there one by one. And after some time and a lot of super glue on my fingers, I ended up with a cute little bucket. I've also added 2 longer sticks with a hole in them to give the bucket a little handle. Now, the shape isn't perfect, especially if you look down from the top, but I'm still pretty happy how it turned out. If we are looking at the in-game building again, there we can see that there's another bucket with a cheesecloth inside. And to be honest here, I didn't have the stamina to make another bucket in the same way I've made the other one, just to cover it up completely with a piece of cloth, so I've made an extremely simplified version. I've still added the metal ring and carved out some ridges to make it kinda look like it was made out of wooden planks. Another detail I wanted to make is the water jar. I started with drilling a hole into a thick piece of wood, and the hole was too small, so I've used another bigger Forstner bit to drill it again. I honestly don't know what I was doing when cutting the sides off, but I've messed up completely and thought I'd rather rely on good old handwork. So on the second attempt with a new hole and the Japanese saw, it was looking better, until I found a strange notch in the wood. I was thinking, huh? Where does this come from? Did I use the saw in a weird way, or what happened? I've used scrap pieces of wood and there was a hole there already. So 3 times the charm it is, and after cutting again and sanding it a little bit, I was happy with the shape. The only thing left to do now was to glue 2 thin side pieces to the drawer, and I've also added 2 little pieces of wood as legs. In the corner we still have something. I can't really tell what this is supposed to be, because when the calves grow up they are in this position, so a table wouldn't really make sense. It could also be a pile of hides from the cows, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense either. Maybe I'm overthinking it. And at the end I've settled for a little sleeping bag for the farmer. It looks like it's made out of cowhide, so you know, I gotta do what I gotta do. In reality I've used some old cloth together with my beeswax and sesame oil mixture to make it look like raw hide first. From that piece I've simply cut out a strip and then tanned it with some cocoa powder, because that gives me a nice brown color. Then I folded it in half and started to sew it together. Now this is actually my first time sewing, so it doesn't look all that good, but hey, it's holding together well enough to add some hay inside to make it more comfortable for the farmer. The last tiny but important detail is the cheese wheel, and I've actually used real cheese, but only the rind of a piece of Parmesan. By the way, I know that soap carving exists as a hobby. Can we please make cheese carving a thing? But anyways, I had it ready and cut out, but then I've looked away for a second and it was gone. Only the scraps of the cheese were left. I don't know if I have mice in the workshop. You know what? Maybe I can even catch one red-handed. Something I still wanted to do was adjust the wood color. And because I've used quote-unquote new wood, the color doesn't really match the in-game building, so I've attempted to change the wood color with a special DIY stain that I've discovered here on YouTube to give the wood a weathered look. For the wood stain I've simply put some steel wool for dish cleaning into a jar and added some white wine vinegar to it. I've later discovered that this type of steel wool doesn't really work because it's too thick or too rough, and it's also made out of stainless steel. So I've added another type of steel wool that is way thinner, and then we end up with this dark, almost purple looking wood stain. After brushing the stain onto the whole building, it looked like this. Pretty cool. But one mistake that I've clearly made was to glue the parts together before staining them. You can clearly see the spots where the wood is covered by super glue, and as a result the stain couldn't reach the wood. So I had to cut away the glue parts, stain the whole thing again, and I've also used the Bunsen burner just to experiment a little bit. After that you can still see the glue parts, but it made it look a little better. And even though I knew that the stain isn't working on the glued parts, I've still used it for the fence and the other wooden parts. The last little tiny detail for the building is the sign on the front wall. To me this looks like a shield with a horseshoe on it. Wait, a horseshoe? A cow shoe? Does that even exist? I've cut a shield out of a thin piece of wood, and I actually have a real old horseshoe here, but it didn't really look like the one from the game, so I came up with my own shape that I drew on a piece of sheet metal. I've cut that one out with a Dremel tool, but before gluing it onto the shield, I still wanted to show you the difference in color we are getting by staining this type of wood. I really like how this turned out, and it looks great on the wall as well. Oh, now we're ready to put on the roof, but before that I've still used some hay to fill up the storage room. Now it's ready to be covered up by one piece of white cloth and some smaller pieces that I've made the same way as I've made the sleeping bag. This time I've cut them into cowhide shape though, and made one darker version tanned with some charcoal dust. Now that we have the building, the fences and all the little accessories ready, we can begin with the final assembly. I've started with the fences around the pasture. In order to make the closing mechanism for the gate work, I had to shave off a little bit of the fence pole. Then I've placed the building inside and went to the garden to get some fresh soil. Then it was time for the accessories. And in the game we can only place the dairy farm on some nice green grass. While having lots of fun watching the grass grow, I've looked in-game again and found out some small details. First of all, there is a table in the building if we look at the little tiny animation on the bottom right. The other detail is the bucket that is shown in the animation and also on this illustration here. We can see that it has two metal rings, and the handle is just a piece of string attached to the upper ring. I might be a perfectionist sometimes, but I also kinda like my version of the bucket, so I've added the second metal ring but left the handle how it was. And I've also built a little table, and maybe we can see how I've built it in a future episode? Maybe? And with all the last little details ready, I went down into my garden again, and now we can enjoy the finished dairy farm.